Thanks, Tom. Thanks all of you for being here today, and you need an editor. In the next 25 minutes, I'll explain what editors do, how we make video games better, and why games, all games, need us. But first, who am I to be standing up here telling you all that? I was a technical writer and editor for about 12 years before getting into video games. I started at Nintendo in 2008, editing developer documentation for their platforms, and moved over to game development in 2010. I've worked on projects at Microsoft, BioWare Austin, ArenaNet, and now BioWare Montreal, helping make the next Mass Effect game, and as a member of our cross-studio editing team, working on Dragon Age Inquisition. Don't worry, even after all that editing, I don't fix your typos when you email me. Whoops. My game experience is with larger companies that have multiple editors, but that setup's still a relative rarity. Accordingly, the content of this talk scales for smaller companies and for teams without a dedicated writer, let alone an editor. In all of those situations, editing can help you. How? Simply put, editors make games better and save money at the same time. We smooth out snags in production, freeing developers to create their best content most efficiently. In practical terms, editors fix narrative and technical writing on multiple levels, track organization, iteration, and publication of that writing, and maintain a unified presentation of intellectual property for a game, a franchise, and a company. That's a lot to dig into, so let's start a little higher. What is editing in games specifically? Traditional editing has been around long enough to specialize. Books and newspapers, for example, have different kinds of editors with different responsibilities. Game editing is newer, not as established, but it uses the same principles, adjusted for the needs of an interactive medium. One principle is that of editing on multiple levels. An editor in video games can provide all-in-one service, from developmental editing, structure, tone, and style, down to copy editing, spelling, grammar, and punctuation. Books or games, though, at high or low levels, editing always has a single guiding purpose. Editing is the art of invisibly refining the author's intentions. Let's break that down. Art. Editing isn't a science, or else we'd have computer programs that could edit everything perfectly all by themselves. A style guide's rules go a long way, but there are always exceptions, especially with creative work. Sometimes you need to break the rules, and it's a person who's best suited to figure out when and how to do that without breaking anything else. Invisibly. You should never notice edits. The writing should sound as if it had always been that way, straight from the author's mind. This seamlessness is especially important when you have more than one author adding words to your game, multiple writers, writers and designers, and so on. An editor can nudge those voices closer together, making the writing sound like it belongs to one product, without losing the individual author's quirks. Refining. Editors work with what's already there, shaping, preserving, and standardizing. Think of it as making the writing what it always wanted to be, like a statue emerging from a block of marble. That sculpting can include rewrites, but usually not wholesale additions, deletions, or changes without author input. Speaking of, author. Editing is about the author, not the editor. We don't insert ourselves into the writing except through collaboration, and it isn't a competition between author and editor. That's another reason why this is an art, not a science. I like to think that editing is only about 25% all those language rules. The rest is relationships, understanding and working with an author, which, as we all know, computer programs never fail at. Finally, intentions. Editors sometimes work more from what an author is trying to say, deciphering subtext and digging out meaning that's hidden in the words because the author isn't entirely clear on it either. That's where the relationship is vital and can really pay off. The better we know each other, the better our results. Editors also work on higher level intentions, what the game needs from the writing, not just what the author wants to do. For example, inserting reminders of essential information that the player picked up 2 levels ago, or streamlining text in one area to make up for overages somewhere else to stay under budget. Knowing those needs requires the editor to have a game-wide understanding, which the author may not have because they're focused on their own section or they're brought onto the project late. An example might be helpful, especially if you haven't worked with an editor before. So here's one from an author who needs an editor, me. This is the initial draft of the art talking point from the previous slide. Right away, I see unnecessary repetition. Human, there, work, and art all show up twice. The repetition of rules sets up the juxtaposition that binds the two halves of my point into a whole, so it can stay, but the placement isn't quite right. Neither is the tone. I need a little more informality and some humor to soften the start of what I know is a long slide. Yeah, punch up that implied slam on computers at the top. We've all been there and can smile at it. The rules versus rules now balance each other better, and I'm upgrading wants to needs to suggest the importance of craft without dragging out that for your art cliche. Go with person instead of the more clinical human, and end on another light note that nevertheless underlines the importance of editing, which ties right back into the talk's thesis as a supporting point should. And there's the version I just read. It's shorter, smoother, and more effective. It's far from perfect, but after just one edit pass, it's definitely better. So, editing improves writing. Remember those different levels of editing, high to low? Working on all of them, in every area, theme, character, plot, and so on, strengthens a story, with the editor guiding that process as the player's surrogate. Like a player, we're experiencing the story from outside the author's head, with a parallax view, watching it from one side to see if it makes sense. Where it doesn't, we can suggest what to add, remove, or explain so that the player will understand too. How do you help people understand something? By making it clear, consistent, and coherent. A story that's clear, you can understand it right away. Consistent, elements appear in the same way with the same meaning or purpose every time. And coherent, it fits together into a unified whole, is a story that people can more easily consume. And we do want consumers. But not just paying customers. Keeping internal teams and external partners, such as publishers, on the same narrative page can improve the development process. If people all understand the game's story, they'll communicate about it more effectively, collaborate more efficiently, and produce higher quality work. Editors support that unity by creating or assisting with narrative documentation, and by communicating the story between teams, from design to art, production, VO, loc, QA, and beyond. And yes, on the customer side, better narratives get better reviews, better word of mouth, and, one hopes, better revenue. But what if your game doesn't have a story? That's okay. A game can still benefit from editing, thanks to non-narrative editing, content management, and IP branding. What's more, the right editor can do everything I'm talking about here, meaning that you get these benefits from just one person on your payroll. Not that the items I'm going to talk about here can't have narrative as well. Those elements show up everywhere in a video game. I'm just using the categories loosely. Editors should be working on user interface text. Our brains like to remember every little term, and will standardize language usage across the whole game. Every menu option, every item description, every loading screen, you name it. We'll even make a style guide for it, and make other people use it too. The 4 C's apply here as well. You want users to understand your game's user interface, and again, not just players. Editing standardizes the output of multiple developers, making it easier for everyone on the team to use and talk about it, instead of juggling different terms and descriptions for the same thing. From the broader standpoint of user experience, editors can be great guinea pigs. We're playing through the game anyway, and as with story, if we don't understand how it all works, the player probably won't either. Geopolitical reviews assess whether content will be offensive to audiences in different regions of the world. And you can't just put anything you want into a game without risking legal action. Editors are a natural fit to track both areas because of our attention to detail, the fact that we're seeing every part of the game, and that rules checker in our brains. We can research what would require licensing, and with the right training or experience, we know what's offensive, where, and why, not to mention how to fix it. For example, changing a character's name because it sounds like a swear word in another language, or not using the thumbs up gesture, because in many cultures, that's an obscene insult, comparable to or worse than the middle finger. Companies may get external experts to handle these reviews, but editors can catch problems early, before you've spent that money, or hopefully too much development time, or insulted a decent percentage of your customers. Editors love to organize. We can do wikis on the design side and checklists for production. BioWare editors set up internal wikis for lore and process documentation the whole project team works from. And we use a checklist of tasks for every single piece of dialogue to make sure it's thoroughly vetted before it goes into localization and voiceover recording. Editing is a strong bridge between development and production. A word's games flow into downstream pipelines via an editor who keeps an eye on the entire process and supports the various owners and contributors from end to end. With VO, we prepare scripts and casting documents, make the pronunciation guide for actors and directors, which translators also use, take notes in the studio, and reconcile subtitle text to the recorded audio so that every line a player hears matches what they see on screen, down to the smallest ad-lib. Editors can be localizations liaisons with authors when they need to fix geopolitical issues. We may also coordinate the handoffs, both scheduling and packaging up the files, and answer translator queries, especially if we've already made a glossary of idioms, fictional jargon, and other terms in the game, a document that helps internal teams too. If you're publishing your game, editors can help with the certification requirements and the submissions to rating boards, ESRB, PEGI, and so on. Producers may be handling all that, but editors have the broad understanding of the game for assisting them, if not just doing it ourselves. Editors know your intellectual property inside and out and can keep it consistent everywhere. The game, your website, press releases, blog posts, you name it. As a bonus, we can edit user-facing content for improved company branding. Everything you send out sounds like your company and no one else. And it's also clear, coherent, and consumable. The 4 C's, remember? Beyond a single game, editors can manage the details of a fiction across a franchise, including all associated games and other products such as comics, toys, and books. At Microsoft, I developed and maintained franchise story Bibles and glossaries, which let narrative designers, writers, and business partners dive right into making the games and ancillary content. BioWare's editors are heavily involved with tie-in products such as Dark Horse's World of Thetis book for Dragon Age, written in part by a BioWare editor. In that way, editors save time and money and bring in additional revenue. Editors can do a lot, in other words, from story brainstorming and pre-production through publication and the transmedia ecosphere. But don't you already have people doing that? Yeah, possibly. Producers or project managers own some of those tasks, but they may have other duties, are usually already overworked, and may not have the skill set to do the editing side as well. Remember, an editor can often do everything I've described here in one full multifaceted package that frees up the rest of your team to focus on their work and make it the best they can. What's more, a dedicated editor will keep our tasks alive and moving through the schedule. They won't get lost in the shuffle, even with rapid changes during the development cycle. Embracing editing has a larger implication that way. You're also embracing that iteration for writing, which is part of building an editing culture. Iteration is deeply entrenched in game development. Make an initial attempt at something, try it out, identify what works, what doesn't, and make it at least a little bit better the next time. In an editing culture, that iterative improvement applies to the narrative and non-narrative writing as well. Authors understand that their work will go through multiple drafts, guided by an editor's perspective and support until it arrives at a place where everyone feels confident in it. They know they might not get it right the first time, and there's no pressure to do so. Therefore, they have more freedom to exercise their craft so they can try new things and get better at it themselves. It's not just an editor supporting those improvements in an editing culture, though. It's the schedule. Editing is valued and planned for, built into every process. Writing always gets reviewed. The UI always gets standardized, and so on. Of course, editing is subject to the same adjustments as any other task when project priorities shift, but fundamentally, it is not optional. The most important part of building an editing culture is that buy-in, and it has to come from management. Editing gets funded, scheduled, and supported just like any other discipline. Your team adds an editor, someone takes on editing duties, or you at least have a friend read through the dialogue of the game you're making in your spare time. If you want editing's benefits, you have to invest in it like that. So what are those benefits? Remember the 4 C's. A consumable game is more easily consumed by developers when they're making it and by players when they're playing it. With editing on board, people understand your game better and are more likely to get out of it what you're working so hard to put into it. Editing helps that process of making the game. An editor can ensure that internal documents are findable and up to date and can track important tasks, as with those wikis and checklists I mentioned earlier. Because of editors' wide scope, the way we see everything in a game, we're also communication hubs, just like producers. And like producers, we can keep multiple teams humming along together. The ArenaNet editing team helps oversee the text pipeline for Guild Wars 2, from design and writing to VO and localization. Setting up that pipeline with its scoping meetings and intermediate checkpoints immediately led to less confusion about word budgets, more cooperation between teams to stay under budget, and sometimes friendly competition, and less wasted time and money throughout the pipeline. And money is where the rubber hits the road, right? Well, I'm here to tell you, with cold, hard numbers, that editors and editing can mean significant savings for your project. I have 2 examples, one small and one large. In a Star Wars: The Old Republic script, I noticed an actor cast for a character who would speak to a character he was also voicing in a different area of the game. The tools couldn't catch that, only a person familiar with the storylines. The VO producers changed the casting before we went into the studio, which saved us on having to recast and re-record the role if we had discovered it after it was in the game. All told, for the actors, studio time, implementation, localization, and testing we now no longer had to worry about, my reading that one script in 5 minutes saved us about $1,000. And on a fully voiced MMO, those 1 scripts could really add up. The BioWare Edmonton editor saved money on past projects in 2 ways. First, by editing, doing that invisible refining on dialogue and non-VO strings. For Dragon Age 2, that trimmed word count led to more than $100,000 saved in text localization alone. Second, by double-checking that the right strings were going out for translation, thereby preventing unnecessary exports and wasted work. For the original Mass Effect trilogy, those quick checks by just a few people saved a lot of money. On Mass Effect 2, more than $450,000. And across all 3 games and their DLC, more than $1 million. Now that we understand editing, what it is and why it's good for a video game, the developers, and the bottom line, why should everyone care? Because editing is bigger than a single game, or even a single company. It should be industry standard. Other media have editors: books, magazines, newspapers, comics, TV shows, films. Those editors make their products noticeably better, and the prospect of creating them without editors can be daunting, if not actually absurd. Video games can and should carry the same cachet as those media, the same respectability, and editing will help them get there. An art form evolves in the crucible of criticism, and in game development, an editor is the internal critic. We examine a game from the inside, bringing to bear our understanding of language, culture, narrative, design, gameplay, user experience, and more. And by constructively criticizing the content and streamlining the production, we support its creators to make the best art they can. Video games stand at a crossroads, exploding in more directions, more platforms, genres, styles, stories, and audiences than ever before. Now is the time to leverage a proven discipline for both creative and financial success. Now is the time for editors, because you need one. We all do. I love talking about editing, obviously, so feel free to contact me anytime on Twitter or LinkedIn to talk more about it, including how to find and hire an editor. In the IGDA Game Writer Special Interest Group, you can find more editors and people editing in other roles. A new SIG for editors is also starting up, where we will share shop talk, job leads, and professional advice with each other and with people interested in editing. Just ask me for details. Thank you to everyone who helped me with this talk, and to you for listening to it. Enjoy the rest of the summit and the conference.